Thinking about it.
There we go.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program on alternative death care, home funerals, and natural burials. My name is Rhiannon Johnson, and I'm the Career Resources and Financial Education Specialist at the Kansas City Public Library. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Jenny Starr, who is our Health and Wellness Specialist. And we have a wonderful presentation for you led by Sarah Cruz, the founder and director of the Heart Land Prairie Cemetery. And we are so excited to have her with us today to share this information, and we hope you enjoy. Thanks so much. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And today, as we've mentioned, and you can see on your screen, I'm here to talk about alternative death care practices. Home funerals and natural burial are the two things I'll be focusing on. These are two distinctly different, but related, can be related concepts in after death care. So let's start with a little bit of funeral history. So back during the Civil War is when embalming became a common practice in this country, because soldiers were dying so far from home out on the battlefield. The medics came up with a way to preserve their bodies long enough for them to be sent home on the train for a proper family funeral. And in those days, they were using sort of a mixture of arsenic, and it's always been sort of a very toxic procedure, and really hasn't changed so much over the years. But when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, they used these same techniques on him and then put him on a train. He had an open casket, stopped at several train stations around the country from Virginia to Springfield, Illinois, where he would be buried ultimately. And people came out to see him, pay their respects to the slain president. And that really marked the time that we began to pay someone to take care of our deceased loved ones for us. Prior to this time, there were funeral directors, but this really kind of like amped them up to a level that was kind of on par with, say, a doctor, another professional, because while we could still tend to the body at home, and we could make a coffin and provide food for the mourners, all of those things, if we were going to have a funeral that was fit for the president and, sort of worthy of the love and dignified, we would need to hire a third party, a licensed mortician, to do the embalming for us. But like I said, prior to that, funerals were very family-centered, spare, quite natural affairs. And as you can see here, this infant death was also a much more common occurrence. So these folks, I'm imagining, have either purchased this little coffin or built it themselves, but gotten that from a local craftsperson. The guys are probably going to go out and dig the grave themselves, and the women have prepared the body and, as I said, might provide food for the mourners. There's that. So funerals today have really turned into, this is just in the past century and a half or so, we've become very accustomed to outsourcing the care of our dead to what has grown to be a $20 billion a year industry. And in the meantime, we've become unfamiliar and a bit fearful and intimidated by what after death care involves, when it really is a natural part of what it means to be human. We did this, we cared for our own dead for millennia until the very recent modern times. While it's easy to quantify what we've traded off financially for these conventional funeral practices, it's harder to quantify what we've lost as families and communities by distancing ourselves from any meaningful involvement in the death care of our loved ones. So a home funeral refers to a family and community-centered approach to after death care. In Kansas and Missouri, a family legally has the right to act as their own funeral director and can do for their deceased loved ones just about all the things a funeral director can. Providing this tender care in the comfort of our own familiar spaces is actually reclaiming a tradition that our not so distant ancestors did as a matter of course before the advent of the modern funeral industry. So home funerals are legal in every state and province in Canada. There are 9 states that require that we hire a funeral director. And that is generally for signing the death certificate or for transportation of the deceased. Neither Missouri nor Kansas are one of those states. I have those listed at the bottom so you can see which states are a little more restrictive in terms of families being able to do it all themselves. But often it's very convenient to hire a funeral director anyway to take care of the process of filing the death certificate or the transportation, of course, if you're not equipped to do that. And embalming is not required by law in any state. And that's something that a lot of us don't know. Like often that's the first question that I'm asked when I'm giving a workshop is like, oh, I thought embalming was required, and it's not. So what is a home funeral? A home funeral may include caring for your loved one at home, church, or elsewhere. This is done by family and friends with professionals if desired. So like I said, if it's, it can be very helpful to hire a funeral director, a funeral professional to help with all of the details. Bathing, anointing, and dressing. These are things that a family may choose to do or not do. And the bathing, sometimes that can be helped with another professional. If a person is home on hospice and the nurse comes to pronounce the death, the nurses are very accustomed to doing these bed baths anyway. Sometimes it's more for the ritualistic aspect of it, more than it is for actually cleaning the body. But it can be a very engaging, beautiful, sort of last tender act of love. A viewing can be held at home or at a church. And again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could have a viewing at home with just it being very personal and private to just family, and then have a big memorial service at a church. It doesn't have to be one or the other. This is just a way of incorporating some of the immediate after death care into caring for your loved one. You can have, again, similarly, a funeral gathering at home or elsewhere, apart from the after death care. And taking care of the paperwork. So the paperwork refers to filing the death certificate, and that is the one legal requirement in every state. Death certificate has to be filed. So if you're thinking of doing something like this and you want to do it all on your own, you just need to investigate, do a little research in advance. I know that in Kansas, all of the death certificates go through the Vital Statistics Office in Topeka. And they will receive information from a family over the phone and then send it on to the attending physician. So a physician needs to sign it. If the person's on hospice, it's very straightforward because it's the attending physician is the hospice doctor. But if it's an accidental death or an unexpected death where someone just dies of a heart attack, then the coroner needs to be involved and write sign the death certificate and also write the cause of death on that death certificate. And also transportation, as we mentioned before. Home funerals can be healing. It says here that they are healing. I'm gonna say that they can be healing because they allow for more time and flexibility. You're not under the schedule of a funeral home. You get to slow things down and do it at your own pace, allowing a natural flow of events and emotions. You know, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for our hearts to catch up with our heads. Like we know what has just occurred, but we haven't had enough time to really process it. And so having a home funeral can really help to just slow things down and allow us to get in touch with the deep emotions that we're feeling. It can also normalize and diminish fears around death. We haven't spent a lot of time around dead bodies probably in our everyday lives, and it can seem a little scary. And it's kind of remarkable how ordinary the experience can be when we're open to just stepping in a little closer and being present to what it is to be around death. It can help to teach children about the life cycle. You can see in this photograph here that these kids, probably while the adult or the person who has died has been laid out and they're waiting for when the cremation is going to happen, these kids are helping to decorate the cremation container, this cardboard box that the person will eventually be placed in. And gives us an opportunity to embrace grief and loss on our own time. And it also gives people a chance to be useful. There's so many things that might need to be done. You can see even from this picture, gathering art supplies, making sure that there's going to be food in the house, and making some phone calls. You know, sometimes it's very helpful to have someone be talking with the professional or making arrangements with the cemetery or the crematory. So there's all sorts of things that allow people to be useful rather than just showing up at a certain time at a funeral home. And of course, finding meaning through that process. Home funerals are safe for caregivers and the deceased. In this photograph here, that's my sister, Rebecca, putting shaving cream on my dad's face. We were just going to tidy up his beard a little bit before people came to the house to see him. And according to the CDC, a dead body does not pose an increased health risk. Most diseases die along with the body, and often diseases are transmitted through droplets, as we know, through COVID, having just gone through that. So through breathing, and a dead person is no longer breathing, and or through bodily fluids. And so if we are keeping the body cool with dry ice packs, or air conditioning, it slows decomposition. And commonly during home funerals, people are kept at home for up to 3 days. And that's generally just giving enough time to make the arrangements with the cemetery or the crematorium to get the death certificate filed before the burial or cremation can happen. So 3 days is about the common amount of time that is here. And again, there's no need for embalming or disinfecting. And I use that word disinfecting because it's often what is written on a funeral director's price list, is that they will disinfect the body, and there's nothing infectious about that dead body. It's really, they could use the word bathing, and I think it's partly what has made us come to sort of fear what after death might involve, because we've gotten a little bit of misinformation over the years. And as I was saying earlier about how if a body has stopped breathing, they're not necessarily going to be putting aerosol droplets into the air. But if you have been caring for that person, using universal precautions to not come in contact with bodily fluids, or during COVID, wearing a mask, you can definitely put a mask over the deceased so that when turning, in case anything were to sort of expel or come out, that those universal precautions when you were caring for the body can also be used after death care, after death care. So here are some of the tools of the trade, if you will. These are all items that you might find around your house, of course, because they're just really used for grooming. And there's some water there in a bowl. You might use some essential oils to make it smell nice. There's lotions and oils. You can see that there's a scarf, a long purple scarf, and also a little roll of what do you call those Band-Aids that kind of, that one up there in the top. But there's a couple of easy ways to close the jaw. Sometimes when people die, their jaw is slightly ajar, their mouth is slightly ajar. So by tying a scarf under the chin and up around your head, kind of like the old-fashioned toothache remedy, and keeping that in place for just a couple of hours while the rest of the care is being done, perhaps dressing the body or doing the washing or rubbing on lotion and that sort of thing. Keeping it in place for a couple of hours, and then when you take it out, usually the rigor mortis is set in and it'll stay closed, or mostly closed. And same with the eyes. If a person dies with their eyes open and that is feeling a little jarring, you can use a weighted eye pad. So over here to the left of the bowl, there's like a rice pack. I think in the old days, we heard that they used coins, and I just don't think our coins are as heavy as they used to be. So we just use a little weighted pack, and that can keep the eyes closed. Again, leaving it in place for a couple of hours, and then they'll stay shut. So this is Dorothy. Dorothy died at home, and her daughter, Marcia, had cared for her brother when he died a few years, maybe 5 years earlier. And she didn't know that it was about home funerals at the time that her brother died. So did the usual. Hospice came over, they pronounced the death. It was like the middle of the night, and the funeral home showed up within about an hour, took the body away. By the time his son had driven from Kansas City to Salina, his father's body had already been taken out of the house. When they went to the funeral home, they were told that he couldn't see him because they hadn't prepared him yet. They hadn't gone to pick the package that they were going to do at the funeral home. So even though he was right there in the building, he was not allowed to access seeing his father. So Marcia didn't want to go through that experience again. And at this point, we had become friends, and I told her about home funeral. So they took care of Dorothy at home, and that's her sister curling her hair. They got her dressed in her favorite dress with the matching jewelry, and brother had bought the coffin and had stored it in his garage until it was needed. And later on that day, they painted her fingernails to match the necklace. It was all very lovely. And having never done any of this before, they just felt so great about being able to do it themselves. Here are some quilts that Dorothy had made, and they put together these photo boards. And this is the sort of thing where you could deliver all this to the funeral home and they'd put them together for you. But they just did it themselves. She was laid out on the back patio. So I love this close-up of Dorothy. She just looks so beautiful and natural. And that's just how she looked in death, and we think that, oh my gosh, to see a naturally dead person, one who has not been embalmed, they might look a little strange, but she just actually looks like she's smiling a little bit. And there are her great-grandchildren who all came, and, they'd run around in the backyard and play, and then come back in and look into the coffin and say hi to their Gigi, their great-grandma. And it was a beautiful day. And the next day, they just loaded her in the back of her son's truck and drove her up to Miltonvale, where she was buried in a conventional cemetery, conventional burial next to her husband. So here's one where they did a home funeral, conventional burial. You can also do a home funeral and a green burial, or you could have a funeral home take care of all the arrangements for you, care for the body, and have a green burial. So you see what I'm saying? It's like, it's not an all or nothing thing. There's all sorts of ways to have sort of a blended funeral experience. So these are some familiar sites. We've got columbarium where up on the upper left-hand corner, where cremated remains are put into sort of boxes along that wall. Over on the right is a one of those where you put actually a body that is in a sealed coffin into the wall. Mausoleum, that's the word of that one. And then down below, sort of more of a crowded city cemetery, perhaps, and then, you know, these old country cemeteries that are all over Kansas and Missouri. I need to do a little thing here to check my notes. Thanks. Okay. So these are all conventional burial practices. The one on the bottom right, the old cemetery, I'm guessing there were quite a few green burials in that cemetery. In other words, not using big sealed metal caskets and not using vaults, but usually in the conventional cemeteries, they are using a vault that is essentially a grave liner. I'll show you some pictures of that in a sec. So what is conventional burial costing us? All right. Every year in the US, and I want to emphasize, these are annual numbers. It's not over time. Every year in the US, we are burying over 827,000 gallons of embalming fluid, over 104 tons of steel in caskets and vaults. You can see that there is a plastic lined steel vault lining the grave that a steel casket is going in and a reinforced concrete steel top on top. 17,000 tons of copper and bronze for like fancy parts of those fancy coffins, and over 1.5 million tons of reinforced concrete, again in vaults mainly, and over 45 million board feet of lumber, including hardwoods and rainforest woods. These are going into the ground in a conventional burial. So here's an example of it's like a grave liner. It's a vault, but this is probably going to go into another vault. Let me take a look at here. What's the difference between a concrete vault and a lined sealed burial vault? And they're showing you how, water is going to get in here, but in this sealed, warranted burial vault, I love that it has a warranty. Whoops, I didn't mean to go back. I mean, how would you know, right? But it includes a warranty, multiple layers of protection for your loved one's casket from external elements. Okay. So a lot of people are more interested in cremation, and cremation, in fact, has grown exponentially in recent history. It also has its own environmental impact, requiring fuel to burn for 3 to 5 hours, depending on the size of the body, at temperatures at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. It's a very industrial process here in this country, and it's known to release into the atmosphere several greenhouse gases, and produces approximately 250 pounds of CO2, carbon dioxide, per cremation, adding up to about 250,000 atmospheric tons annually. So it's something to consider if you're thinking about cremation in terms of its environmental impact. Whoops. So there's a couple of things here. Whoops. It's very sensitive. some intriguing so-called natural burial products that you may have heard of, and I might be bursting some bubbles here, but here's the first one. This is Coeo's Infinity Burial Suit, also known as the mushroom burial suit in California. Now, J. Lee designed this, and it started out as an art project, and then she did all of these experiments with like her own fingernails, and the concept is that this is a burial suit that is embedded in it are mushroom spores, and as the mushrooms grow, they're going to detoxify the body, and so that it can just return to the earth, not as a toxic thing. So it's based on really sketchy science. People are paying upwards of $1,500 for a mushroom burial suit. And the thing is that it doesn't work. The kinds of mushrooms that they're talking about don't grow at 3.5 feet under the ground. It might work if it was just up above ground as the way it's displayed here, but it's really more, I think this and the next one that I'm going to show you, I think their value lies in the fact that they're so intriguing and people are interested in them, and it leads to us having essential conversations with people that we love about how we want our bodies to be treated, or how we want to make less of an environmental impact when we die. So those conversations are essential. I just don't, I think it's kind of gimmicky. It doesn't really work. Similarly, let's take a look at Capsula Mundi. Many of you have seen this. It's the idea of turning into a tree when you die, and you can be buried in this beautiful egg-shaped burial pod with a tree that is going to grow right out of the top of it. Again, these two people that designed this in Italy are designers, and they came up with this idea, which is really beautiful, and it's super artistic, and it absolutely doesn't exist. And I don't think it's ever going to exist. The little ones that they have showing there, and I don't believe they're made out of the same biodegradable, the little eggs, but those are for cremated remains. Now, those do exist. You can order them. But the idea of being able to put a body into a fetal position, I mean, I have dressed a couple of dead bodies, and they are really hard to move around. And then somehow getting them in this pod that is huge. They've shown them in these galleries, and they tower above people because they have to be able to, squeeze this person in it. And then digging a hole deep enough to accommodate this thing and lowering it into the ground. So it's a beautiful idea. Essential conversations are being had, but it's not realistic, and it doesn't exist. Now, these are a couple that actually are viable ways of tending to the dead that are more environmentally friendly. So you've probably heard of human body composting. Recompose is based in Seattle, Washington, and you can see that they've got these big pods. That is Katrina Spade, who developed this idea. And a body is placed in wood chips, and mainly wood chips and hay and alfalfa are what they use. Goes into this pod. They say in 30 days, the whole thing is broken down using, water and turning and the way that you would compost in your garden. I'm not exactly sure how they're dealing with the bones, but anyway, that's happening in Recompose is in Washington. And then there are in a few other states, it's also legal to compost a human body. So the Natural Funeral is in Lafayette, Colorado, and these are not as industrial, for lack of a better word. as the ones as recompose, using the same concept though of adding wood chips and alfalfa and hay, and then they go into these wooden boxes that are lined, and then the lid goes over, they're rolled on those rollers, and this process takes like 6 months. And from what I understand, after a certain amount of time, months in, they remove the bones and grind them, as bones are grinded in a cremation. You might not have known that, but there's a lot of remaining large bones, and those are grinded up and then added back to the compost, I think. So that's happening in Washington, in Oregon, and in Colorado now. You can look all this up online and get a lot more information. But what is basically green burial? So green burial is only unembalmed bodies in biodegradable containers, including shrouds. There are no vaults used in a natural burial. And at green and natural burial, those terms are interchangeable. In certain places, goals involve land restoration or conservation. The locations are marked by GPS and or native memorials, and it reduces your carbon footprint and returns human remains to the earth with ecological integrity. These are some of the natural burial cemeteries in the region. And most of these are what we call hybrid cemeteries, where they have a conventional cemetery, but now with enough people asking about green burial, they've opened part of their cemetery to green burials. So you can see the names of those. And Heart Land Prairie Cemetery, which I'm the founding director of, is an all natural burial ground. So we're going to get into that in a second here. Here are some natural burial products made of recycled paper, wool, silk shrouds, bamboo, cardboard, plain pine boxes. Or you can make your own. So the woman on the left was buried at Heartland, wrapped in a quilt that her mother made. And she's on a burial board. So that board is lowered into the ground with the ropes and then just stays in the ground because it's also biodegradable. Okay. And these guys are building a burial box for their mom. So Heart Land Prairie Cemetery is located in central Kansas near Niles. And we are restoring the burial meadow to native prairie species. So we've replanted 8.5 acres, and we maintain walking trails throughout the site. Here are some of the trails. And I'm going to walk you real quick through my dad's home funeral. So that was, he lived in Denver, and his name was Ed Hawley. And he wanted to be buried out at Heartland Prairie Cemetery, even though he was not from Kansas, just because I started it. And he thought that was a good idea. My mom's going to be buried there as well. So after he died, we took care of him. You saw the picture of my sister shaving his cheeks. And we wrapped him in this piece of fabric made of African fabrics. And we spent 7 years in East Africa, and he pretty much devoted his career to helping with issues in Africa. And so we thought it was appropriate to wrap him in African clothing, an African shroud. There's my daughter. This happened right before COVID hit, but we were all, aware that we needed to use our, disinfect our hands. So she made a little sign that says, "Share the love, not the germs." We laid out our photo boards right there in my parents' apartment, and all of his activist buttons. And there's all the ladies in the family gathered around my dad. This is right before we invited people into the house. We had food and drink, and he was in their bedroom, so people could come in as they chose and spend some time paying their respects to him, and then come back out and have another glass of wine. Now we had to get back to the car. We're driving him out to Heartland, and we found out that the burial board would not fit in the elevator. So we had to strap him to this dolly and bring him down the elevator. And we got him into the back of the car, drove him out to Kansas. So here's my family carrying him out to the grave site. Now that had been prepared by my husband. He hand dug the grave. At Heartland, that's one of the options. About 4 or 5 families have chosen that so far, but most hire our grave digger who uses a backhoe. But I just want to emphasize it was just our family. There was no one there telling us, you know, what we should or shouldn't be doing. And it's our practice at Heartland. Often we put a bed of leaves down on the bottom as well as over, but especially with a shrouded body, it makes for putting the soil back in a little nicer, a little more gentle to have that layer of leaves on top. And that's something everybody could participate in. It was easy for my mom, who wasn't going to be able to like lift a shovel. And there we are closing the grave. It was very muddy that day. So we mark the graves with these little metal markers that I emboss with the name and the birth and death dates. And then that is put on a piece of rebar and it stays in the center of the grave and is flush to the ground. You can see there's some other grave sites behind me, and I'm just placing my dad's marker. Right now it looks completely different. We've got all these tall grasses. The restoration project has been very successful, and it's just beautiful going out there different times of the year. So here's another couple of pictures. Again, and a different family that brought their loved one out from Topeka. And, you know, again, people who have not engaged in a process like this, but as soon as they're given the invitation, you know, it's almost like I often say that it's an ordinary experience that becomes extraordinary because we haven't had this as part of our practice in our families and communities for so long. So it's a very engaged experience to have a green burial at Heartland. We have the families lower the body into the grave themselves with our support and instruction, and then often they'll choose to cover the grave completely. And like I said, different times of the year, we have a lot of flowers out there, native flowers, and we've just recently gotten like the certification that we are a monarch butterfly way station because we have so many milkweeds out there. Again, the flowers in spring. And if you want to hear more home funeral stories, I have a podcast called A Path Home that you can listen to anywhere you get your podcasts. You can visit our website for more questions if you have any other questions on Heart Land Prairie Cemetery. And one of the things I should mention, we don't sell grave sites in advance of the death unless someone is on hospice. But yeah, I can explain that more if you like. But there's a whole frequently asked questions, FAQs, on the Heart Land Prairie Cemetery webpage. And of course, since this is at the library, I wanted to recommend some books. So these are some of my favorites, and these are all listed on Heart Land Prairie Cemetery's website as well. If you want to go there, you can click on, I think it says Books We Love or something like that. So there we go. That is the end of my presentation, and I hope we have time for some questions and answers.
We do. Thank you, Sarah, so very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. Thanks, everyone.